He thought he was untouchable. When 17-year-old Ethan Walker swaggered into a Franklin County courtroom, he wore a smirk that could curdle your blood. He laughed at the grieving family of the man he'd brutally murdered. He rolled his eyes at the judge. To him, it was all just a game, a show starring him. But what Ethan didn't know was that the game was already over. The evidence was stacked, the prosecution was ready, and as the walls closed in, the person who would deal the final devastating blow wasn't a detective or a lawyer. It was his own mother. What could make a mother stand against her child? What could drive a teenager to such evil? And then mock justice itself. This is the story of arrogance, denial, and the horrifying moment when one mother's love turned into the most painful truth of all. If you're into true stories that make your heart race and your mind spin, hit that like button. It really helps this channel grow. Subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next deep dive into the darkest corners of real life. And hey, share this one with someone who thinks they've seen everything. Trust me, they haven't. It began like any other quiet evening in Westerville, Ohio. One of those suburban pockets where nothing bad is supposed to happen. The kind of place where porch lights glow warm against trimmed hedges and neighbors wave without knowing each other's names. On October 12th, the air was crisp, the leaves whispered against the pavement, and the scent of dinner still lingered from open windows. Inside his modest two-story home on Maple Creek Lane, David Campbell, a 52-year-old high school history teacher, was winding down after grading papers. He was the sort of man whose kindness wasn't loud, it was steady, consistent. A teacher loved by his students, respected by his peers, and cherished by his sister, Amelia. He had no enemies, no secrets, no reason to fear anything. But in less than an hour, his quiet home would become a crime scene that would stain the town's memory forever. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of a 911 call, short, panicked, and cut off. A neighbor reported screams coming from the Campbell residence at 10:47 p.m. When officers arrived, the house looked almost peaceful. The porch light was still on. The door was closed. A newspaper rested neatly on the welcome mat. But when one officer peered through a side window, that illusion shattered. Inside, chaos had erupted. Furniture overturned, books scattered, and blood smeared across the pale beige carpet. David lay motionless in the center of the room. The violence was senseless, vicious, and without any sign of motive. His wallet sat untouched on the counter. Nothing was stolen. This wasn't a robbery. It wasn't revenge. It was something darker, an act without reason, carried out with a brutality that made even seasoned investigators pause before stepping inside. News of the murder spread through Westerville like a shockwave. Within hours, police tape and flashing lights turned the quiet cul-de-sac into a stage of grief and disbelief. Neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering theories, an intruder, a drug deal gone wrong, a mistake in identity. But none of it made sense. David Campbell wasn't the kind of man who found trouble. He taught history, not drama. He spent weekends tending to his garden, not wandering into danger. And yet danger had found him anyway. For his sister Amelia, the news came in the middle of the night, a call from detectives that split her world in two. She described it later as the kind of pain that has no sound. The moment she heard her brother's name and the word homicide, everything after that became a blur of sterile police stations, paperwork, and the suffocating silence of disbelief. For days, the town mourned a man who symbolized everything good about their community. Vigils were held, flowers piled up on his lawn, candles flickered against the windows of homes that had once felt safe. But behind the scenes, investigators were piecing together fragments, shoe prints, fibers, fingerprints. And then came the breakthrough. A neighbor's doorbell camera across the street had caught something. A lone figure, dressed in dark clothing, walking away from David Campbell's home just minutes before the 911 call. Young, confident, Unhurried, almost casual, that grainy clip became the key that would open a door no one was ready to look behind. Because when police traced that shadow to a name, Ethan Walker, 17 years old, a former student of David's, they realized the horror wasn't a random act of violence. It had come from within their own community, from the boy next door. When detectives first watched the doorbell camera footage, they didn't know what to make of it. The image was grainy, the figure blurred by distance and shadow, but something about it felt wrong. The person wasn't running or panicking. They were walking away from a brutal crime scene with the slow, easy rhythm of someone strolling home after curfew. A hoodie concealed most of the face, but the body language spoke volumes. Shoulders loose, head high, almost proud. Investigators zoomed in frame by frame, hoping for a detail, a reflection, a glint of recognition. And then they caught it, the faint outline of sneakers, patterned with a distinct tread. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start connecting dots. Within 48 hours, a name began circulating through the department. Ethan Walker, 17 years old, lived just a few blocks away, and, as it turned out, he'd once sat in the front row of Mr. Campbell's history class. Ethan wasn't unknown to police. A few minor run-ins, vandalism, trespassing, the kind of teenage mischief that gets filed under poor decisions. But those who knew him said there was always something off. Teachers remembered a boy who was smart, brilliant even, but cold, detached. He'd argue for the sake of argument, smirking when classmates got upset. Some students said he liked to push people just to see when they'd break. It wasn't loud bullying. It was psychological, cruel in ways that didn't leave bruises. To most, he was simply that arrogant kid who thought he was better than everyone. But to detectives reviewing the evidence, Ethan's name didn't just fit. It echoed. He lived less than half a mile from the crime scene. He owned a black hoodie like the one in the footage, and his social media history painted a picture of a teen obsessed with dark imagery, knives, video games, violence. One caption read, "No one can stop me." The arrest came quietly, a Thursday morning just after sunrise. The tactical team moved fast, their footsteps heavy against the manicured lawns of Maple Creek Lane. When Ethan's father opened the door, confusion gave way to shock as officers flooded inside. Upstairs, Ethan was sitting on his bed, controller in hand, the sound of simulated gunfire from his video game echoing through the room. He barely reacted when they told him why they were there. No panic, no denial, just a flat stare, almost bored. When detectives found the pair of sneakers hidden in his laundry basket, their soles stained with reddish-brown traces later confirmed to be David Campbell's blood, it sealed his fate. They also discovered a fantasy-style knife missing from his collection, a blade whose serrated edge matched the wounds described in the autopsy report. Evidence didn't just point to Ethan, it screamed his name. Yet, even with overwhelming proof, something about Ethan's demeanor unsettled everyone in that interrogation room. Most suspects, especially teenagers, cry, panic, or plead. Ethan did none of that. He sat back, almost amused, answering questions like he was participating in a debate. He corrected detectives on their phrasing, smirked when they grew frustrated, and at one point actually asked if the case had made the news yet. It was arrogance, yes, but more than that, it was emptiness. A void where empathy should have been. To the officers watching him, it felt less like they were interviewing a scared kid, and more like they were observing a storm in human form, detached, unpredictable, and disturbingly calm. And as the footage rolled on, and the evidence mounted, one chilling truth became clear. This wasn't just a murder investigation anymore. This was the unraveling of a mind that seemed to lack even the most basic trace of humanity. The deeper investigators dug into Ethan Walker's life, the clearer it became. The warning signs had always been there, only no one wanted to believe them. In his quiet suburban neighborhood, Ethan had always been the kid who seemed different. He wasn't loud or rebellious in the usual way. He was polite when he wanted to be, distant when he didn't. But there was something behind his eyes, an unnerving stillness, as if he was constantly watching, studying, calculating. Neighbors described him as oddly mature for his age. Teachers said he was too clever for his own good. And yet beneath that surface of teenage intellect was something darker, a fascination with control and a subtle delight in seeing others uncomfortable. His classmates remembered how he'd mock people in small, cutting ways, never loud enough to get caught, but sharp enough to wound. To most, he was just a smart, sarcastic teenager. To those who really looked, he was a mirror of something much colder. When police interviewed people from his past, a disturbing pattern emerged. One neighbor recalled finding their family cat injured in their backyard years earlier. No one could prove it was Ethan, but the timing, the silence, the smirk he gave when asked, it lingered. A former teacher mentioned that Ethan would write short stories filled with violence and power, stories that ended not in redemption, but domination. And then there were his online activities. His social media was a shrine to nihilism, memes about chaos, quotes about being above morality, and a trail of dark humor that blurred the line between irony and confession. He wasn't just detached. He was amused by detachment. Every post, every sarcastic comment hinted at a boy who saw empathy as weakness and pain as proof of superiority. Still, it was easier for everyone, teachers, parents, even friends, to shrug it off. He's just edgy, they'd say. He'll grow out of it. But he didn't grow out of it. He grew into it. Ethan's parents, Elizabeth and Robert Walker, had very different views of their son. Robert, often away for work, saw Ethan's confidence as a sign of independence. Elizabeth saw the distance and filled it with excuses. Whenever a teacher called home about his behavior, she defended him. When he bullied another student, she called it a misunderstanding. In her mind, Ethan wasn't dangerous. He was misunderstood. But that quiet enabling created a storm. At home, Ethan learned that no matter what he did, there would be no consequences. He could lie, break things, manipulate, and still be met with patience and softness. The rules that applied to other kids didn't apply to him. And that's how monsters are made, not with sudden violence, but with years of subtle reinforcement. By the time he reached 17, Ethan wasn't just confident. He was convinced he was untouchable. Detectives would later describe his personality as a void wrapped in arrogance. He didn't fit neatly into any psychological box, not psychotic, not insane, just empty. When they asked him about his victim, David Campbell, he shrugged and said, "He was fine. He talked too much." That's how he referred to the man he'd stabbed dozens of times, as if he were discussing an inconvenience. It sent chills down the spines of even the most experienced investigators. But what they didn't yet know was that this chilling detachment would only grow worse in the months ahead, because the courtroom would become Ethan's stage, and for the first time, the world would see what happens when arrogance meets justice head-on. The room was small, square, and gray, the kind of space designed to strip away comfort. A metal table, 2 plastic chairs, a camera mounted in the corner, recording everything. For most people, sitting in that room feels like being trapped under a microscope. But when Ethan Walker walked in, handcuffed and silent, he didn't look afraid. He looked bored. His expression was that of a kid waiting for detention to end, not someone about to be questioned about murder. When detectives asked if he wanted water, he declined. When they reminded him of his right to an attorney, he shrugged. "I'm good," he said casually. His voice was flat, his tone almost amused. From the moment he sat down, one thing was obvious. Ethan didn't think this was an interrogation. He thought it was a test, one he was sure he'd pass. Across from him sat Detective James Rowe, a 20-year veteran of homicide, a man who'd seen everything from domestic murders to contract killings. He'd dealt with teenagers before, but never one quite like this. Ethan had no tells, no visible signs of stress. His heart rate barely changed. Rowe began the way he always did, soft, conversational, calm. He asked about Ethan's day, his friends, school. Ethan answered in short, clipped sentences, each one dipped in sarcasm. When asked if he knew David Campbell, he nodded. "Yeah," he said. "He was my teacher. Nice guy. Bit of a nerd." He smirked. Rowe noted the expression, that faint curl of arrogance that never seemed to leave the boy's face. "When was the last time you saw him?" the detective asked. "A while ago," Ethan said. "Why? Something happened to him?" He leaned back, crossing his arms like a teenager being scolded for missing curfew. It was theater, and Ethan thought he was the director. The detectives played along. They didn't push. Not yet. Rowe shifted the conversation, circling closer to the night of the murder. He asked where Ethan had been around 10 p.m. on October 12th. "Home," Ethan said easily. "Playing video games. My parents were asleep." His voice didn't waver. It was smooth, rehearsed. Too rehearsed. Rowe made a note in his file but didn't challenge it. He'd done this long enough to know that silence could be more powerful than accusation. So he let the lie sit. The room filled with the hum of the overhead light, the faint creak of chairs. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have. Rowe watched Ethan, the slight tapping of his foot, the flicker of his eyes toward the camera. He was performing. But underneath that calm surface, something restless pulsed. Not fear, ego, the need to win. An hour passed, then 2. Ethan stayed composed, even playful. When the second detective, Linda Chen, entered the room, he gave her a once-over and said, "So, is this the good cop, bad cop thing? 'Cause it's kinda cliché." Chen didn't rise to it. She simply placed a photo on the table, a still frame from the doorbell camera. The figure in the photo was unmistakable. Same height, same build, same hoodie. "You recognize this person?" she asked. Ethan leaned forward, studying it for a moment. "No," he said, shrugging. "Can't really tell who it is. Looks like half the guys at my school." His tone was still confident, but his fingers twitched. Chen didn't reply. She placed another photo beside the first, the pair of sneakers found in his room. "These look familiar?" she asked. Ethan hesitated, then scoffed. "Yeah, they're mine. So what?" "So," said Rowe quietly, "our lab matched the blood on them to David Campbell." That was the first moment the mask cracked. Not much, just a flicker. Ethan blinked, his jaw tightening for a split second before the smirk returned. "You sure about that? Maybe your lab made a mistake." His tone was forced now, more defensive than defiant. The detectives didn't pounce. They just watched. The silence stretched again, deliberate, suffocating. Rowe leaned forward, his voice low. "Ethan, we know you were there. We've got the camera footage, the knife, the shoes. But here's the thing. What we don't know is why. Help me understand that." Ethan's eyes narrowed, studying the detective like he was trying to decode a trick question. "Why?" he repeated. "Does there have to be a why?" The words hung in the air like a chill. For a brief moment, the atmosphere in the room changed. The detectives weren't speaking to a frightened kid anymore. They were facing something colder. Chen felt it first. That unnerving sensation that you're not talking to a person, but to a void that's wearing a human mask. Ethan's tone had shifted from defensive to analytical. He tilted his head slightly, like he was dissecting them. "You guys keep asking the same thing," he said, smirking. "Like you want me to say I'm sorry or something. But people die every day, right? What's so special about this one?" Rowe exhaled slowly, hiding the anger crawling up his spine. He'd dealt with killers before, but none had the audacity to sound bored about it. He took a different angle. "David Campbell was your teacher," he said softly. "A good man. He helped kids who struggled. You were one of them, weren't you?" Ethan's smirk faded just slightly. "He thought he was smarter than me," he muttered. "And that bothered you?" "No," Ethan said, sitting up straighter. "It just wasn't true." It was the first honest thing he'd said all night, and it chilled the room. Outside the interrogation room, through the observation glass, prosecutors and detectives watched in silence. What they were seeing was textbook narcissism, but amplified. Ethan wasn't just arrogant, he was proud. He wanted them to know he wasn't like everyone else. He didn't feel guilt or fear or even anger in the way others did. He saw the interrogation as an opportunity to perform. Every question was a prompt, every pause a cue. When Chen mentioned the murder weapon, the decorative knife from his own room, Ethan smiled. "You found that?" he said, as if congratulating them. "Guess you guys aren't as dumb as I thought." Rowe stood then, pacing slowly. "You're young, Ethan," he said, voice steady but edged. "You think this is some game, but it's not. You killed a man. You ended a life. Do you understand what that means?" Ethan looked up, expressionless. "Yeah," he said softly. "It means you're going to keep talking until I say something that makes you feel better about yourself." The words hit the room like ice water. Rowe turned away, jaw tight, and Chen just stared, not at Ethan, but through him. Because behind those words was a chilling truth. Ethan didn't care about the consequences. He didn't even see them as real. After 4 hours, the detectives stepped out to regroup. They had the evidence, the confession was close, but they wanted him to break himself. They knew with someone like Ethan, pressure wasn't the key. Vanity was. So they let him stew alone. For 20 minutes, he sat motionless, staring at the table. Then, when he thought no one was watching, he whispered something under his breath. The camera picked it up. "Told you they wouldn't figure it out." He said it like he was proud. When the detectives returned, they played their final card. Chen set down a small speaker and hit play. The distorted hum of the doorbell camera footage filled the room. The grainy clip showed a figure leaving the Campbell house, then zoomed in. Ethan's posture, his walk, the unique bend in his left elbow from a childhood fracture, all unmistakable. Rowe didn't speak. He didn't need to. Ethan stared at the screen, face unreadable. When it ended, he leaned back, smirk gone, eyes cold. "Fine," he said at last. "You want a story? Here's your story." And then he confessed. But it wasn't a confession filled with tears or regret. It was mechanical, emotionless. Ethan described how he'd broken into David Campbell's home just to see if I could. He'd expected the man to be asleep. He wasn't. They'd struggled. "He got loud," Ethan said, "so I made him stop." His voice was calm, clinical, as if he were recounting a science experiment. He described where he stabbed him, how he wiped the knife, how he watched the life leave David's eyes. "It was quiet after that," he said softly. "Peaceful." Rowe couldn't move. Chen's pen froze mid-note. There was no remorse, no anger, only fascination. "Why did you do it?" Chen asked finally. Ethan shrugged. "I was bored." Just 3 words, but they sucked the air out of the room. Later, prosecutors would say that moment sealed his fate. The confession wasn't coerced, wasn't emotional. It was pure, unfiltered nihilism. And yet, in his mind, Ethan thought he'd won. To him, confessing wasn't defeat, it was control. He'd told the story on his terms. The smirk returned when they cuffed him, the faintest curve of pride curling at the edge of his lips. "You're gonna make this a big deal, huh?" he said. Guess I'm famous now." Detective Rowe didn't answer. He just looked at the boy. Not a man, not even a monster, but something hollow. The kind of hollow that doesn't come from evil, but from absence. As Ethan was led away, the camera kept rolling. The steel door shut behind him with a heavy thud. Rowe sat down, rubbing his temples. 17, he muttered under his breath. 17 years old, and nothing behind the eyes. In that quiet, airless room, everyone felt the same unspoken truth settle over them. The sense that they hadn't just solved a murder. They'd stared into something far worse, because this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the reckoning. The day the trial began, the skies over Franklin County were the color of steel. A cold rain drummed against the courthouse windows as crowds gathered outside, drawn by the morbid pull of tragedy. The story had spread far beyond Westerville, the teen killer who mocked the judge. Every local news station wanted a shot of him, the boy whose smirk had become a symbol of everything people feared about a generation without conscience. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Rows of wooden benches overflowed with reporters, family members, and curious spectators who'd waited for hours to get in. The air was thick with tension, that peculiar silence that hangs before a storm. On one side sat the Campbell family, faces carved from grief. On the other, the Walkers, Elizabeth pale and trembling, Robert stone-faced and distant, and between them all, like a black hole drawing the room's energy inward, sat Ethan Walker. He wore a suit that didn't fit, too large at the shoulders, sleeves bunched at the wrists. But he wore it like armor. His hair neatly combed, his expression unreadable, he leaned back in his chair as if this were just another boring school assembly. When the bailiff called the court to order, Ethan didn't even flinch. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Olivia Rodriguez, sharp, composed, and quietly relentless. She had built her case brick by brick, confident that no amount of youthful arrogance could weaken the foundation. When she rose to deliver her opening statement, her voice was steady, clear, not angry, not theatrical, but heavy with purpose. She began not with evidence, but with a story. David Campbell, she said, was a man who believed in second chances. He taught history, but what he really taught was compassion, patience. The kind of patience that changes young lives. He believed that even the troubled ones could be reached, until one of them reached back in the darkest way possible. As she spoke, she didn't look at Ethan. She looked at the jury. She described the crime scene in measured detail, painting a picture of senseless violence and a life extinguished for nothing more than boredom. Every fact she laid down was another nail. The DNA, the knife, the video footage, and finally, Ethan's own confession. "When you hear his voice," she said, "you'll understand what we're dealing with. Not a lost boy, not a moment of teenage rage, but a cold, deliberate act carried out by someone who felt nothing." Then she turned slightly, facing Ethan for the first time. "And you'll see it for yourself." Her eyes met his, calm, steady, unblinking. Ethan smirked, leaned back, and whispered something to his lawyer. The jury noticed. The defense attorney, Michael Clark, rose next. He looked tired. The kind of tired that comes from months of trying to humanize a ghost. His voice was low, deliberate. He didn't deny the obvious. "There's no question that what happened was horrific," he began, "and no one in this room, least of all my client, can undo that." A murmur rippled through the crowd at the phrase, "least of all my client." Even Clark seemed to catch himself. He went on, building his argument not on innocence, but on context. He painted a portrait of a troubled home, a fractured family, a boy with unaddressed psychological issues. "This case," he said, "is not about evil. It's about failure. The failure of systems meant to protect and rehabilitate our youth. Ethan Walker is not a monster. He's a symptom." It was a desperate angle, but it was all he had. He pleaded for compassion, for understanding. But as he spoke, Ethan wasn't listening. He was fidgeting with his pen, glancing at the ceiling, occasionally smirking as if amused by the whole spectacle. Every few seconds he'd glance at the jury, not with fear but with curiosity, like he was studying them. And the jury, in turn, studied him. Over the following days, the prosecution's case unfolded like a perfectly rehearsed play. First, the first responders, officers and medics, testified about the crime scene. Their voices were steady, but their eyes betrayed the horror they'd witnessed. One officer described the moment he looked through the window and saw the body. "You don't forget something like that," he said quietly. The jury didn't look at the photos, not for long, but Ethan did. He leaned forward, eyes fixed on the screen, studying each image like a film critic dissecting a scene. Next came the forensic experts, the scientists who spoke in the language of evidence. Blood spatter analysis, DNA sequences, matching fibers. Every testimony built the same unshakable conclusion. Ethan Walker was at the scene, and he'd done it. But what unsettled the jury most wasn't the evidence. It was Ethan himself. Because while the prosecution built a fortress of facts, Ethan dismantled his own defense in real time. He yawned during testimony. He smiled when the autopsy photos appeared. And when the medical examiner quietly listed the number of stab wounds, 28, he whispered something under his breath that made the bailiff stiffen. "Guess I really overdid it." It wasn't loud enough for the microphones, but it was seen by the jurors, by the family, by his own mother, who gasped and covered her mouth. Judge Harris slammed his gavel so hard the sound echoed off the marble walls. "Mr. Walker," he said, his voice cold, "you will show respect in this courtroom. Do you understand me?" Ethan looked up, met the judge's glare, and, just barely, smiled. Behind the scenes, Michael Clark was coming apart. Every night he visited Ethan in his holding cell, trying to prepare him for the next day. He pleaded with him to stay quiet, to at least pretend to feel remorse. "You're not helping yourself," Clark said. "The jury's watching every move you make. You need to stop." Ethan interrupted. "They like me," he said flatly. "They can't look away. That's how you win, right?" Clark just stared at him, realizing, maybe for the first time, that this wasn't arrogance. It was delusion. Ethan didn't understand the stakes because he didn't believe in them. When the prosecution played Ethan's recorded confession, the courtroom fell silent. The sound of his voice filled the room, calm, detached, disturbingly casual. "I didn't plan it. I just wanted to see what it'd be like. He saw me, tried to stop me, so—" "Yeah." He laughed, a small, breathy laugh that made the hair on the back of every neck stand up. On the recording, Detective Rowe asked, "Did you feel anything after it happened?" Ethan's voice replied, "Yeah, hungry." The tape stopped. Nobody moved. Rodriguez stood still, letting the silence speak for her. When she finally looked up, her voice was steady but low. "That's who he is." By week 2, the media had turned the case into a spectacle. The courtroom sketches of Ethan's half-smirk appeared on every news outlet. Talk shows debated whether he was the product of a broken home or a born sociopath. Outside, protesters carried signs that read, "Justice for David and no mercy for monsters." Inside, though, the trial began to shift. The prosecution had done their job. Now it was the defense's turn, and their only hope was to humanize the inhuman. Clark called a psychologist to the stand, Dr. Evelyn Reed, who spoke about adolescent brain development, impulse control, and empathy deficits. She explained how the frontal lobe, the part of the brain that weighs consequences, isn't fully developed until the mid-20s. Teens can make horrific choices without fully understanding their permanence, she said. They're not beyond rehabilitation. It was persuasive, clinical, and utterly destroyed by the cross-examination that followed. Rodriguez rose, calm and deliberate. "Dr. Reed," she said, "would you agree that millions of teenagers struggle with emotional regulation?" "Yes." "And would you agree that most of them don't break into their teacher's home and stab him 28 times?" The psychologist hesitated. "That's true. So are we talking about immaturity or something else?" The courtroom went silent again. Ethan's foot tapped under the table, not in anxiety, but impatience. When Dr. Reed mentioned his narcissistic tendencies, he smiled faintly, as though flattered. To him, the word narcissistic wasn't an insult. It was validation. The defense's next strategy was emotional, to call Ethan's mother, Elizabeth Walker, to the stand. She was meant to be the humanizing element, the final plea for compassion. But when Clark approached her before she testified, she looked distant, hollow. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. "Not the way you want." Clark squeezed her hand. "Just tell them he's your son." She nodded, but inside something had already broken. That day she sat in the gallery watching her son as witness after witness described his cruelty. She watched him roll his eyes, watched him grin when the victim's sister cried. And in that moment, something in her finally cracked. The illusion of the boy she'd defended for so long disintegrated before her eyes. She saw him not as her child, but as the thing he had become. When the defense rested, she still hadn't spoken, but her silence felt heavier than any testimony. The trial had become more than a legal proceeding. It was theater, and Ethan was its unwilling star. The jury couldn't look away from him, the way you can't look away from a car crash. Some of them tried to find traces of the child he'd once been. They looked for remorse, for fear, for anything human. But all they saw was detachment. One juror later said, "It was like staring into a mirror that doesn't reflect anything back." The prosecution closed with precision. Rodriguez didn't raise her voice. She didn't use theatrics. She simply reminded the jury of what they'd seen and heard. "The defense wants you to believe this was a mistake," she said, "that this young man deserves a chance to change. But change requires conscience. And what you've seen here, what you've all felt, is the absence of that. Ethan Walker is not a child lost in confusion. He is a predator who found pleasure in suffering." She pointed gently toward him, her hand steady. "He doesn't need your pity. He needs your judgment." When the jury was dismissed for deliberation, the courtroom exhaled for the first time in days. Ethan leaned back, hands clasped behind his head. "That went well," he muttered to no one in particular. His lawyer closed his eyes. "You have no idea what you've done," he said quietly. Ethan's smirk deepened. "I told the truth. Isn't that what they wanted?" Hours later, the jury returned, unanimous. But Judge Harris postponed the reading of the verdict until the following morning. The court adjourned for the night. Families left in silence. Cameras flashed outside. And somewhere in the crowd, a mother stood frozen in the rain, realizing the only thing left she could do for her son was to tell the truth he refused to face. Because the next day, before the verdict could even be read, Elizabeth Walker would stand and ask to speak. And when she did, the story of Ethan Walker would change forever. In the weeks leading up to the verdict, Elizabeth Walker moved through her days like a ghost haunting her own life. Every morning she woke before dawn, not because she couldn't sleep, but because she didn't deserve to. The news called her son a teen killer, the face of youthful evil, a reminder that darkness sometimes grows behind the picket fences of suburbia. She couldn't turn on the television without seeing him. That same smirk, that same photograph, frozen in time. Friends stopped calling. Neighbors crossed the street when they saw her at the grocery store. But none of that hurt as much as the silence inside her home. The house felt smaller now, quieter, as if even the walls were ashamed. Robert, her husband, hardly spoke. He buried himself in work, pretending that their son's name wasn't being whispered on every local broadcast. But Elizabeth couldn't pretend anymore. Every headline, every courtroom photo forced her to relive the same truth. She had raised the boy everyone else was terrified of. She replayed his childhood in fragments, searching for the moment when she had lost him, when the sweet, curious boy she once held had started to disappear. Ethan had always been sharp, precocious even, but there was a coldness to his curiosity. As a toddler, he didn't ask why people cried. He asked how long they cried. He'd pull the wings off insects and watch, fascinated, when they struggled. Other mothers would have seen warning signs. Elizabeth saw a child exploring the world. When teachers called about his behavior, she defended him. "He's misunderstood," she'd say. When he bullied another kid, she blamed the other child for provoking him. Deep down, she always knew he wasn't like the others, but she mistook detachment for intelligence, cruelty for confidence. Her love had been unconditional, and that was the problem. Every time she covered for him, every time she softened his punishment, she built a world where consequences didn't exist. Now, sitting in the courtroom, listening to testimony after testimony about what he'd done, she understood what she had truly built. A cage made of love, with no locks, no walls, and no limits. Each day in court was its own private punishment. She sat behind her son, watching him through a lens that shifted a little more each time. At first, she searched his face for traces of remorse. Surely beneath that arrogance, there was a flicker of the boy she remembered. But she saw nothing. No fear. No regret. Not even confusion. He would lean toward his lawyer and whisper jokes, smirking as evidence piled against him. Once, during the showing of the crime scene photos, she reached out, touching his shoulder softly. A silent plea, a mother's desperate gesture to anchor him to something human. He turned, eyes cold and distant, and said under his breath, "Don't touch me." The words were quiet, but they sliced through her. In that instant, she realized he didn't see her as a mother. He saw her as an inconvenience, another pawn in a world built for his amusement. When she looked at him after that, she didn't see her son anymore. She saw something wearing his face, and that thought, that quiet, unbearable thought, kept her awake at night, staring into the dark until dawn, wondering if love had blinded her to a monster she'd helped create. The breaking point came during the victim impact statements. Elizabeth watched Amelia Sanchez, the victim's sister, walk to the stand, a woman hollowed by grief, yet somehow holding herself upright. Amelia's voice trembled as she spoke about her brother, about the small kindnesses that had made him loved by so many. She described the empty chair at every family dinner, the holidays that would never feel right again. And when she turned to face Ethan, that broken, trembling voice asking him why, Elizabeth looked at her son and saw nothing. He didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't blink. It was as if he were watching a performance and silently critiquing the acting. That was the moment something inside Elizabeth snapped, quietly, completely. The tears that had threatened to spill for weeks dried up. What replaced them wasn't anger or sadness, but a cold, terrifying clarity. She had protected him his whole life, wrapped him in excuses, in forgiveness, in love. And that love had allowed him to believe he was untouchable. She realized she wasn't just the mother of the defendant. She was his accomplice, not in the murder itself, but in the making of the boy who committed it. And so, for the first time since his arrest, she made a decision not out of love, but out of truth. The next morning, before the verdict could be read, she would stand and speak. Not for Ethan, not for herself, but for the man her son had taken, and for the world that needed to understand what she now knew too late. Monsters aren't always born. Sometimes they're raised by love that refused to see them for what they were. The courtroom on the morning of the verdict felt heavier than it had in weeks. Reporters packed the gallery, pens poised above open notebooks, cameras waiting just beyond the door. The air was saturated with expectation, the quiet kind that makes every sound echo twice as loud. The jurors filed in one by one, their faces pale from sleepless nights of deliberation. The Campbell family sat together in the front row, hands clasped, as though holding each other's grief in place. Across the aisle, Elizabeth Walker sat alone. Her husband hadn't come that day. He couldn't bear it. She clutched a folded piece of paper in her trembling hands, though she didn't plan to read from it. She'd written and rewritten her thoughts so many times that the words no longer existed on the page. They lived in her chest, burning like a secret. When the bailiff called for silence and Judge James Harris entered, the sound of the gavel seemed to cut through the air like thunder. "This court is now in session," he said, his voice a low tremor. "We will proceed with the reading of the verdict." Every person in that room leaned forward, everyone except Ethan Walker. Ethan sat back, relaxed, his chair slightly tilted, a faint grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. His suit was rumpled from weeks of wear, but he still carried himself like he was in control, as if this was another act in a play where he was both the writer and the star. He had spent the trial performing, smirking when witnesses cried, whispering sarcastic asides to his lawyer, scanning the jury with an almost flirtatious amusement. In his mind, this wasn't the end. It was a finale. His name had been in every headline, his photo on every screen. He was infamous now, and to him, infamy was just another form of immortality. When the judge asked if both sides were ready to proceed, Michael Clark, his weary defense attorney, nodded. But before the clerk could stand to read the verdict, a voice broke through the quiet. "Your Honor," it said, soft at first, almost lost beneath the shuffle of papers. Then louder, steadier. "Your Honor, please, I need to speak." All eyes turned. Elizabeth Walker was on her feet, her face pale but determined, the crumpled paper still clutched in her shaking hand. The room erupted into whispers. Clark immediately stood, objecting. "Your Honor, the defense has rested. Mrs. Walker is not—" "Sit down, Mr. Clark," Judge Harris interrupted, his tone both stern and curious. His gaze shifted to Elizabeth. "Mrs. Walker, this is highly irregular. On what grounds do you wish to address the court?" Elizabeth took a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep, somewhere raw. "On the grounds of the truth," she said, "the truth that hasn't been spoken in this courtroom. You could have heard a pin drop. Even the reporters stopped scribbling." Judge Harris hesitated, studying her face. The anguish, the exhaustion, the desperate resolve. "Proceed," he said finally, voice low. "You may speak briefly." Michael Clark buried his face in his hands. Ethan, for the first time, turned to look at his mother. His smirk vanished. Elizabeth stepped toward the witness stand, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. She didn't look at Ethan, didn't even glance his way. She looked straight ahead as she placed her trembling hand on the Bible and took the oath. When she began to speak, her voice wavered, but it was strong enough to carry. "I was supposed to come here to help my son," she said quietly. "That's what good mothers do. They protect their children. They tell the world that they're good inside, that they just made a mistake. That's what I've done his whole life. I've told everyone that Ethan was just misunderstood, that he needed more time, more patience, that he'd grow out of it." She paused, swallowing hard, her voice trembling. "But I was wrong. I was wrong about everything." As she spoke, the courtroom seemed to shrink around her. "When Ethan was little," she continued, "I saw things I didn't want to see. He was cruel to animals. He lied without reason. He'd hurt other children and smile when they cried. Teachers tried to tell me something was wrong, but I wouldn't hear it. I said he was gifted, sensitive. I told myself he was just different. Tears streaked down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. I wanted to believe that love could fix him, that if I just gave him everything, defended him, covered for him, I could keep him safe from the world. Her voice cracked. But I wasn't keeping him safe. I was teaching him he could do anything, that there were no consequences. I built him a world without walls, and now you all see what grew in it. Every word hit like a hammer. The jurors watched in stunned silence. The Campbell family leaned forward, transfixed. Even Judge Harris's stoic expression softened slightly. Elizabeth's confession wasn't rehearsed or calculated. It was the sound of a lifetime of denial collapsing in real time. I kept thinking he'd change, she said. I told myself he was just going through a phase. But when I sat in this courtroom and saw him laughing at that woman, she gestured weakly toward Amelia Sanchez, whose eyes filled with tears. I realized I didn't recognize him anymore. The boy I loved is gone, and the thing sitting there... She pointed toward Ethan, her voice trembling but clear. That's what I made? The silence that followed was unbearable. You could feel it pressing down on the room. And then a sound, a scrape of a chair. Ethan had stood up, his face twisted in rage. "You're lying!" he shouted, his voice raw, stripped of its smug calm. "You lying!" "Sit down, Mr. Walker," the judge snapped, gavel slamming. But Ethan wasn't listening. He lunged forward, eyes blazing, every ounce of his composure gone. "You think you're a hero now, huh? You think this makes you better than me?" he screamed as bailiffs restrained him. "You're the reason I'm like this. You made me." Elizabeth didn't flinch. She looked at him with tears spilling down her cheeks and said softly, "I know." For the first time since the night of the murder, Ethan's mask shattered completely. The calm, detached arrogance evaporated, replaced by something primal and furious. The jury recoiled. The courtroom was chaos, bailiffs shouting, reporters scribbling, cameras clicking like gunfire. Judge Harris ordered a recess, his voice booming through the noise. But the damage was done. In that single moment, the illusion of Ethan Walker's control disintegrated. The smirking prodigy had become a flailing, screaming boy, undone not by evidence, but by truth. The truth his own mother had finally spoken aloud. When the room finally settled, Elizabeth was escorted back to her seat. She didn't look at anyone. Her confession had been both her punishment and her release. Michael Clark sat in stunned silence, his entire defense obliterated by the very person meant to save it. Olivia Rodriguez, the prosecutor, didn't smile or gloat. She simply nodded, as if acknowledging that justice had just taken a form no one had expected. Ethan sat restrained, chest heaving, eyes burning with fury and betrayal. The cameras caught it all. The tears, the rage, the moment he screamed at his mother before being let out, and that footage would later play on every news channel in Ohio. But for those who were there, it wasn't spectacle. It was revelation. When the session resumed, Elizabeth remained still, eyes downcast, as the judge restored order. He didn't scold her for her interruption. He didn't need to. "The court," he said quietly, "has just witnessed something very rare, a mother's truth. It may not have been by the book, but perhaps it was exactly what needed to be heard." Then he looked toward Ethan. "Mr. Walker, your mother's words will not affect the legal process, but they have shown us what no evidence could." His gaze hardened. "They've shown us who you are." Elizabeth's testimony became the turning point of the trial, the final crack that split the story in two. From that day forward, Ethan Walker was no longer seen as a misunderstood youth, but as a symbol of something far more unsettling. What happens when empathy dies and entitlement takes its place? As reporters spilled out into the rain to relay what they had just witnessed, Elizabeth remained seated, staring at the empty witness stand. For the first time, she didn't cry. There were no tears left. She had done what she came to do, destroyed her son's defense, and in doing so, freed the world from the illusion she'd spent 17 years maintaining. It was the cruelest form of love imaginable, but perhaps, in its own tragic way, the most honest. The morning of the verdict dawned under a bruised sky. Rain had fallen through the night, washing the courthouse steps clean, but it couldn't wash away the tension that hung over the city. By 8 a.m., the plaza outside was a sea of umbrellas, news vans, and murmuring voices. Inside, the corridors smelled faintly of coffee and nerves. Everyone knew this was it, the final day. The trial that had gripped Ohio for months was about to reach its end. Security was doubled, cameras lined the hallway, and when Ethan Walker was escorted in wearing the same ill-fitting suit, all eyes locked on him. But this time, something was different. The swagger was gone. The grin that had once played across his face had hardened into a mask of simmering defiance. He sat down slowly, hands cuffed, eyes scanning the room not with amusement but with fury. Across the aisle, Elizabeth Walker was there again, hands clasped tight around a rosary, her face pale but unflinching. She didn't look at her son. Not once. The crowd quieted when Judge Harris entered. The gavel struck once, sharp, commanding, final. This court will now hear the verdict in the case of the state of Ohio versus Ethan Walker. Every breath seemed to vanish. The jury foreman stood, a folded sheet of paper trembling in his hand. For a moment, even the rain outside seemed to stop. The foreman cleared his throat. "On the charge of murder in the first degree," he said, voice wavering slightly, "we, the jury, find the defendant, Ethan Walker, guilty." The word landed like thunder. There was no outburst, no cheer, just the collective exhale of a town holding its breath for too long. Elizabeth bowed her head. The Campbell family broke into tears, their sobs muffled by the weight of relief and sorrow. Reporters scribbled furiously, the click of keyboards echoing through the chamber, and at the center of it all sat Ethan, motionless. His jaw flexed once, twice. Then he smiled. A small, almost imperceptible smile that sent a chill through everyone watching. It wasn't the smirk of victory this time. It was the smile of someone who still refused to believe in consequence. Judge Harris allowed the murmurs to fade before speaking. "Mr. Walker," he said, voice low but resonant, "you stand convicted of one of the most senseless acts of violence this court has ever seen." He leaned forward, eyes fixed on the boy before him. "You have shown no remorse. You have mocked this process. You have turned tragedy into spectacle. But today, this ends." The judge paused, his gaze flickering briefly toward Elizabeth, then back to Ethan. "You are 17 years old, but this court will sentence you as an adult. You took a life in cold blood, and the law requires that you face the full weight of that choice." He lifted the gavel slightly. "You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The sound of the gavel striking wood reverberated through the courtroom like a gunshot. Gasps rippled through the audience. A reporter dropped his pen. Amelia Sanchez closed her eyes, whispering a prayer through trembling lips. But the loudest sound of all came from Ethan himself, a sharp, bitter laugh. The bailiffs moved in, gripping his arms, but he twisted slightly, eyes burning with defiance. "Life?" he said, his voice breaking into a sneer. "You think that's going to fix anything? You think locking me up changes what I am?" His voice grew louder, echoing against the marble walls. "You people are pathetic. You all need me to be the monster so you can feel better about yourselves." His lawyer tried to pull him back, but Ethan kept talking, his words spilling like venom. "You think I care? You think any of this matters?" He turned suddenly toward his mother. "You wanted the truth, Mom? There it is. I don't regret it, not a second. He was weak, and I—" He didn't finish. The bailiffs slammed him back into his seat, handcuffs rattling, his voice cut off by force. Elizabeth rose slowly, trembling but composed. Her lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came out. Instead, she met her son's eyes, those same eyes she'd once seen shining with childish curiosity, and whispered a single word only he could hear. Enough. For a moment, something flickered across Ethan's face, confusion, maybe fear, before the mask returned. But the crowd had seen it, that fleeting crack in the armor. Judge Harris stood, towering over the chaos. "Remove him from my courtroom," he ordered. "Now!" The bailiffs dragged Ethan toward the door as his laughter echoed behind him, hollow, manic, desperate. Cameras flashed, reporters surged, and then the door slammed shut and the laughter stopped. Silence filled the space he'd left behind. The judge set his gavel down, exhaling heavily. Court is adjourned. His voice carried the exhaustion of a man who'd looked into the abyss and seen it stare back. Around him, the crowd began to move again. Slow, shell-shocked, uncertain. The Campbell family embraced, tears of relief streaming down their faces. Amelia whispered, "It's over." But across the aisle, Elizabeth remained still, her gaze fixed on the door through which her son had vanished. She felt no relief, no satisfaction. Only the crushing weight of truth, that the world was finally safe from her son, but she would never be free of him. She turned toward the window where rain streaked the glass and whispered to herself, "He's finally where he belongs." But even as she said it, her voice broke, because she wasn't sure if she was talking about prison or about hell. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the air sharp and cold. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, shouting questions, lights flashing like lightning. "Mrs. Walker, do you believe justice was served? Mrs. Walker, do you have anything to say to the Campbell family?" Elizabeth didn't answer. She walked slowly down the steps, her heels clicking softly against the wet stone. Each step felt heavier than the last. At the bottom, she stopped, looking up at the sky, gray and endless, and let the rain wash over her face. She thought of the boy she'd once held, the man he'd become, and the life he'd destroyed. Behind her, the courthouse doors swung open, and for a brief second, she heard his voice, muffled, angry, fading down the hallway. And then it was gone. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Goodbye, Ethan." For the first time, the words felt real. The crowd's noise faded, the cameras dimmed, and the mother who had once believed love could save her finally understood what love truly was. The courage to let go of the child she'd already lost. The first night inside Franklin Correctional was quiet. Unnaturally quiet. No shouts, no clang of metal doors, no chaos echoing down the halls. Just silence. For most inmates, that silence was the hardest part, the space where thoughts crept in and memories pressed against the mind like ghosts. But for Ethan Walker, silence wasn't a punishment. It was familiar. The cell was small. A concrete box with a cot, a toilet, and a slit of a window that caught only a fraction of moonlight. When the guard locked the door and walked away, Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall as if waiting for something to happen. He wasn't scared. He wasn't angry. He was curious. Curious how long it would take for the world to forget him. Curious if the cameras were still talking about him. Curious what it would feel like to disappear into the system, to become a name without a face. Somewhere, deep inside, he expected someone, maybe his mother, to visit, to explain the misunderstanding, to tell him this was all just another test he'd passed. But the door stayed closed. The silence stretched, and for the first time in his life, no one was watching. Days bled into weeks, the routines repeating like clockwork: wake up, line up, eat, return. In prison, time isn't counted in minutes, it's measured in sameness. Most new inmates break within days. Some lash out, some cry, some beg. Ethan did none of that. He moved through each day like a shadow, polite when spoken to, detached when not. The guards kept an eye on him at first. A few even muttered under their breath about the teen psycho. But he never caused trouble, never started fights, never spoke out of turn. It was eerie, his calmness, his precision. Other inmates avoided him, not because he was dangerous, but because there was nothing to read in him. Most men in prison wear their anger like armor. Ethan wore nothing at all. Once, another inmate tried to provoke him, shoved him in the lunch line, muttered something about the baby killer. Ethan didn't react. He just stared at the man, expression blank, for several seconds too long. The man backed away. From that day on, no one bothered him again. Yet behind that calm exterior, something had begun to shift. Not remorse, not realization, but an unfamiliar emptiness. Nights grew longer, the silence heavier, and though he didn't understand it, a thought began to take root. What if this really is forever? Meanwhile, the world outside moved on, or at least tried to. The Campbell family rebuilt their lives one fragile day at a time. Amelia started volunteering at a grief center, helping others find words for losses that had none. Every time she lit a candle for her brother, she imagined him at peace, finally free from the senseless cruelty that had taken him. But peace was something the town couldn't find. Westerville had changed. The house on Maple Creek Lane was sold, then resold, then demolished entirely. No one wanted to live where kindness had met its end. The high school retired David Campbell's classroom number. Every year, new students passed by the empty hallway where his memorial plaque hung, and though most didn't know the full story, they felt its weight. And Elizabeth Walker. She had vanished. After the trial, she sold her home, changed her name, and left Ohio. Neighbors said she moved somewhere near the coast, though no one knew for sure. She never granted interviews. She never sought sympathy. It was as if she'd chosen to live in exile from her own past. But every so often, a small envelope would arrive at the Franklin Correctional Facility. No return address, no note inside, just a Bible verse written in careful handwriting. Ethan never read them. He kept them in a drawer, unopened, as if even acknowledging them would make them real. As years passed, the boy who once mocked a judge began to fade into myth. His name appeared less in headlines, more in cautionary tales told in classrooms and courtrooms alike. The footage of his smirk, that brief chilling grin when the verdict was read, became the haunting symbol of a generation's fear. But inside his cell, the myth meant nothing. The fame he'd once craved had turned to silence. His reflection in the steel mirror grew older, harder, unfamiliar. He still refused to admit guilt, but the certainty that once fueled him had dulled into something else, a quiet awareness that time itself was the only thing he couldn't outsmart. Some nights, when the prison was dark and the wind howled through the narrow vents, he would close his eyes and see flashes of what came before. The classroom, the teacher's voice, the color of the carpet, the shock in David Campbell's eyes. He never felt remorse, not in the way others meant it. But he began to dream, and in those dreams, he wasn't the killer or the victim. He was just a boy, standing in a hallway, waiting for someone to tell him what he was supposed to become. When morning came, the dreams vanished, and the silence returned, endless, heavy, absolute. And in that silence, Ethan Walker finally met the one thing he had spent his whole life running from: himself. Years passed. The story of Ethan Walker, once the headline of every nightly broadcast, began to fade from the public eye. The trial footage that once flooded social media had been archived, the journalists moved on, and the town of Westerville, after years of unease, rebuilt its rhythm. The Campbell family found a fragile peace. Their grief didn't vanish, but it softened, taking shape in quiet acts of remembrance. Scholarships in David's name, lectures about empathy and warning signs. For them, healing came through giving. But beyond those quiet victories, a shadow still lingered. Whenever the anniversary of the murder approached, the same question always returned in the local news cycles. How does someone so young become so cold? There was never a satisfying answer, only echoes of the trial, the mother's trembling voice, the smirk that haunted the courtroom. That image, caught on film, a boy smiling as the word guilty fell, became the kind of ghost that lives in public memory. The story faded, yes, but it never disappeared. Evil rarely does. It just changes shape, moving quietly into the corners where people stop looking. Inside Franklin Correctional, the years carved Ethan into something different. The arrogance of his youth hardened into stillness. Not remorse, not peace, but something colder. He adapted easily, almost too easily, to the structure of prison life. Guards described him as quiet, respectful, even polite. He never caused trouble, never picked fights, never broke the rules. But there was something about his calm that unsettled everyone around him. When most men tried to survive, Ethan seemed to observe. He spent hours in the library, reading psychology textbooks, legal case studies, and philosophy. He never spoke about the murder, never mentioned the trial, never said his victim's name. The only visitor he ever received was the prison chaplain, who claimed Ethan could quote scripture with unnerving precision but lacked the warmth behind it. One guard once said, "You look in his eyes and it's like looking through glass. He's there, but he isn't." That guard transferred a month later, citing stress and a feeling he couldn't shake. The unease spread slowly, like a draft through the corridors. Strange little things began to happen around Ethan's cell. Letters left for other inmates vanished. Arguments erupted in the hallway whenever he was near, and one officer swore he saw two hardened inmates stop fighting the moment Ethan looked at them. There was never proof of manipulation, never evidence of threats, but everyone knew to keep their distance. He didn't have to raise his voice. Silence did his talking. Even the warden, a man who prided himself on treating every prisoner the same, admitted in a rare interview that Walker made him uneasy. "He doesn't act like he's serving time," the warden said. "He acts like he's waiting for something." Outside the prison, professors and psychologists began citing Ethan's case in academic papers. His name became shorthand for the study of affective deficiency, a term clinical enough to sterilize the horror behind it. Students wrote essays about him. Podcasters revived his story every few years. The boy who mocked a judge had become an academic subject, a curiosity, a myth, a cautionary symbol that refused to die. And yet, for all the talk, Ethan himself never changed. He aged, yes, from 17 to 25 to 30, but his face remained eerily calm, untouched by time's usual marks of remorse or fatigue. Every few years, a new intake officer or counselor would try to reach him, convinced they could break through the wall. They always failed. One by one, they left those meetings with the same description: empty, intelligent but empty. To the staff, he was a routine, a number, a meal, a name on a chart. But to new inmates, he was a rumor. They whispered about him in the cafeteria, about the way he could read people, how he knew when fights would break out before they did. No one could prove anything, but those who crossed him seemed to end up isolated, reassigned, transferred, silent. When asked, Ethan only smiled and said, "People make their own choices." It wasn't a threat, but it didn't need to be. Some nights, when the prison lights dimmed and the corridors fell into shadow, guards passing his cell would swear they heard him speaking softly to himself, not mumbling, but conversing. When asked about it, he only shrugged. "I think better out loud," he'd say. There was never a hint of madness in his tone, and somehow, that made it worse. Outside, the town tried to bury his legacy, but every so often it resurfaced. A student researching the case would stumble upon the footage. A journalist would write a retrospective. A documentary producer would request access to the transcripts, eager to revisit the teen who mocked the judge. Each time, the same old images reappeared: the smirk, the mother's confession, the final outburst. And each time, the story ended the same way, with the reminder that some people aren't broken, they're hollow. In his cell, Ethan learned about these projects through whispers, sometimes catching sight of his own name in a guard's newspaper. He'd smile faintly, folding the page just so. He didn't crave fame anymore. He simply expected it, as if notoriety were the only proof he still existed. Years later, when a new warden came through and ordered a purge of archived inmate files, Ethan's name surfaced again, his case used in seminars about criminal pathology. Ethan Walker, the lecturer would say, remains one of the most studied juvenile murderers in recent memory. But behind those academic words, something darker lingered, an unease that refused to be erased. And so the years went on. The world outside moved forward. New crimes, new tragedies, new names. But in that narrow cell, the silence never changed. On the anniversary of his sentencing, the chaplain came to visit. He found Ethan sitting by the small slit of a window, staring at the fog. "Do you ever think about what you did?" the chaplain asked gently. Ethan turned his head, just enough to make eye contact. His eyes were calm, clear, and terrifyingly aware. "All the time," he said. "But thinking and feeling aren't the same thing." The chaplain didn't reply. He stood, crossed himself, and left the cell without another word. When the door shut, Ethan smiled faintly and leaned back against the wall, the faint hum of the lights flickering overhead. In the corridor beyond, a guard paused. That same uneasy feeling crawling up his spine, the same sense that the air near that cell felt colder than the rest. He shook it off and walked away. The next morning, during rounds, another guard glanced through the narrow slot in the door. Ethan was awake, sitting perfectly still, eyes open, calm as ever. The guard moved on. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds. The world kept turning. But somewhere deep inside Franklin Correctional, behind thick steel and endless silence, a boy who once smiled at justice sat and waited. Not for freedom, not for forgiveness, but simply for the world to remember his name again. And in that waiting, in that stillness, the echo of who he was and what he'd done lived on. Not loud, not violent, just quiet, persistent, eternal.